Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you might be calling from. Today on the webinar, we're going to be discussing key findings from the WestSmart Gig Driver EV study. We have five amazing speakers here that will be talking about the project, key takeaways and responses, and key findings from the study. I am going to be your moderator. I am Simbiat Yusuf Muller. So I'm going to go quick so I can get everyone to talk about what we're here for. So today we're going to have Jossi Fritz-Mauer. We're going to have Dr. Patrick Singleton from Utah State University. We're also going to have Bryn Grunwald from Rocky Mountain Institute, James Campbell from PacifiCorp, and Ian Sargent from Ford that will all be sharing some key findings. Our agenda today is going to be as follow. We will have the with the welcome remarks. We will also have some overview of the WestSmart program by James Campbell. We will have an overview of this TNC EV study. We will then share some key findings, and then Ian and James will take it away with some key takeaways. If you have any questions during the presentations, we're asking that you submit them in the attendee chat. We'll get through the questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. We will also be sharing the webinar slides as well as the recording with you all. So please stay tuned for that. And we will keep the conversation going offline if we don't get to all of the questions. And now I am going to pass it over to James for the key overview of the WestSmart program. James?
Great, thanks, Samia. I appreciate that, and welcome everybody, and thank you to all of our panelists here and for all the hard work they've done. As was mentioned, my name is James Campbell. I'm the Director of Innovation and Sustainability Policy at PacifiCorp. We're a regulated investor-owned utility. We operate in 6 states. We're in Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, California, Oregon, and Washington. I personally live in Salt Lake City, but as I said, we operate in all 6 states. Now, we kind of began the transportation electrification journey back in 2016, where we really made a big effort into expanding EV infrastructure and EV adoption. In 2017, we got a grant from the Department of Energy called the WestSmart 1.0, what I like to refer to it. And there we tried to focus in on, is there things we can do from an infrastructure standpoint that can increase EV adoption throughout the region? So we really were pretty early in that process, where we helped put in infrastructure along key interstates. We did some other kind of key infrastructure-based programs to try to really encourage that adoption, and we were successful. Particularly in Utah, that's where a lot of the programs investments were. We saw significant growth in EVs. We went from really a 0.04% up to about 3% in just a 3-year period. So it was a pretty significant increase. But then in 2021, we realized it's not just about infrastructure. Infrastructure is a key part of it, but really to address EV adoption and the transition to transportation electrification, you had to take a much more ecosystem and regional approach. And that's when we did this WestSmart at scale. This is kind of the 2.0, which is what we're talking about today. And really the WestSmart at scale, what we wanted to do was focus on really these 5 key focus areas. Again, infrastructure was important, but you had to address it from this kind of broader ecosystem approach. So we looked at not just installing infrastructure on interstates, but what about destinations? And so we wanted to focus on destination highways out to national parks and recreation areas. That way, EV users have access to infrastructure to where they actually want to go. We also then focused on underserved regions as well, including rural, but also communities that didn't have access to infrastructure. We then looked at urban mobility. What were some of those key things we can do within different solutions in the urban, like with transit, TNC that we're going to talk about today. We also looked at some e-car shares as well at affordable housing. That was a part of that. Underserved communities, how we can expand that. So we looked at putting in car shares, and that was really successful. We also realized that you got to address another big area of electrification, which is heavy duty. So we looked at port and freight, did analysis at that. And then lastly, we looked at kind of communities and workplace. It's one thing to just encourage workplace charging, but what we saw was that you needed to do more than just that. And as the number of EVs increased, we really had to start embracing smart charging. So we did some other projects there. But that was the WestSmart program in whole. We had these 5 key focus areas, and then we had another 12 kind of sub projects within each of these 5 focus areas, but it really created this regional ecosystem where they're very complementary to each other. And one of those key sub projects within the urban mobility focus area was our TNC EV study. And so we really assembled this great team to work on this. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Ian or I guess it was Patrick, sorry. I'll hand it over to Patrick, who's going to talk about really the program. So Patrick.
Thanks a lot, James. And it's great to be here to tell you a little bit more about this specific project looking at gig drivers and electric vehicles. So we had a couple of key objectives for this. First, we wanted to understand the driving and charging behavior of those drivers who used electric vehicles and worked for what we're calling transportation networking companies, TNCs. Those would be companies like Uber and Lyft who provide ride-hail or rideshare services. We also slightly expanded that to include delivery drivers, so those who might work for Grubhub, Instacart, or doing other food or other deliveries. And we wanted to look at this across the Western states in this project. We also tried to understand the experiences and perceptions that these gig economy drivers have, especially around EVs and charging. And then finally, another objective was to share our lessons learned, and that's what we're here to do today, to talk about best practices and recommendations for electrifying this gig driving work. So we took a 3-pronged approach to this work. First, we conducted outreach and recruited participants, so drivers who used these apps. Second, we then had them complete a series of surveys. And third, we analyzed and understood their driving and charging behaviors. So I'll talk about each of these in turn briefly. So first, as James mentioned, we looked at several cities throughout the Western US: Portland, Oregon, Salt Lake City, Utah, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Phoenix, Arizona. And a big thanks to Ian, Barrett, and Forth for going out and recruiting drivers in these 4 cities. We did in-person recruitment roughly from April 2022 through May 2023. We visited the places where we thought these drivers might be staying, whether that's TNC hold lots, for example, at airports, whether that's charging stations, or other key destinations like hotels or entertainment districts. We then asked drivers if they'd be interested to participate in the study. And the first step was for the drivers to fill out an online survey. And this survey asked them about their characteristics of their vehicle, the work that they do for these app-based companies, if they used an electric vehicle, how was their charging experiences, what were their perceptions of EVs and for doing this kind of gig driving work, and then some demographic characteristics. Overall, we recruited and had about over 250 drivers participate in this first part of the study. You'll see throughout some of my slides the BEV and the GPH acronyms. BEV means battery electric vehicles, so fully electric vehicles. GPH is our reference for gas-powered or hybrid electric vehicles, so not fully electric or not electric at all. After the initial survey, we invited those BEV drivers to complete a series of recurring surveys every couple months where we asked some updated questions about how they were working and how they were still charging. We also invited those BEV drivers to participate in a second stage of the study in which they used an app from FlexCharging that helped us gather information about their driving and charging behaviors. So I'll pass it over now to Jossi to talk about more about the findings from that piece of the study.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. Just by way of introduction, my name is Jossi Fritz-Mauer. I am the Director of Program Management at FlexCharging. FlexCharging is a software company that is helping utilities and other planners prepare for the influx of residential managed charging. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, we worked with Forth to couple on to some of their survey and outreach and get as many drivers as possible who were driving BEV electric vehicles to download the FlexCharging app and then sign up there so that we could monitor their charging and driving behavior. We did this via the embedded telematics that were in the vehicle. And it was a pretty seamless process that allowed us to see this behavior on an ongoing basis. As Patrick alluded to, there was ongoing recruitment across the 4 major metro areas, and we also provided some support for one of the other WestSmart studies as well. That support changed over time in terms of how many drivers signed up. There were some differences. So in some cases, we would lose access to vehicles either because the drivers would sell their car or there was a change in their password and we weren't able to get the update from them. Or in some cases, their connected car subscription, which was foundational to us being able to get access, might have changed to a monthly or an annual fee and they weren't in a position to pay it. But for the most part, we had a large number of participants and a lot of data collected from 2022 and 2023. And that's what we are going to be speaking about during this study today. So let's dive into that. So, this is, we believe, the largest gig study conducted to date. And over the course of it, we collected over 400,000 miles of trip data from each of the segments across the 4 major metro areas. In 2023, which is the bulk of the data that's included in here, we had about 30,000 miles per month across all of the participants. And you can see that breakdown on an annual basis and on a geographic basis in the chart here. All of this data added up to a key number of insights. First one that we want to share is that gig drivers tend to charge at different locations than other EV drivers. So for purposes of this comparison and all the other ones, FlexCharging used the gig drivers aggregated across the 4 major metro areas in the West, and compared them against non-gig drivers that are enrolled in other utility programs that FlexCharging runs on behalf of other utilities. Typically residential managed charging programs where people are charging at home. And so you can see that if you look at the percentage of total charge sessions for both corridor and public charging, which is in the pink and orange, gig drivers had about twice as many of their sessions happen at those locations as opposed to what's typically understood to be residential or work charging. So both of those cases went from about 1% to 2% to 2 to 3%. And so you can see a pretty big uptick in the amount of charging that the gig drivers are doing at, let's say, more publicly traveled areas where there's typically a higher rate of charging as well. Alongside this, not only were they charging more frequently at these places, but we also saw a decidedly different pattern in when that charging was occurring. So we created a heat map and broke down each of the days into 4 categories. So early morning hours between 1 and 7, sort of this midday period up until noon, and then this early afternoon evening period, and then finally the nighttime hours. And you can see that the gig drivers had a much higher percentage of their driving of their charging happened during those early morning hours. So the period typically between midnight and 7 a.m. As compared to a control sample of non-gig drivers that are enrolled in standard utility programs. And so a much greater percentage of the energy that they were getting was happening during these early morning hours. And for this purpose, we aggregated all of the locations together. So whether they were charging at home or at a public or a corridor charging, we just wanted to see when that charging was occurring. As you would probably expect, combining the last two insights from the slides, corridor charging and infrastructure utilization was a lot different if you look at that and drill down into it. So gig drivers were much more likely to use those resources during the overnight hours when the sun was down and later in the day, as opposed to non-gig drivers, which use them more evenly throughout the day, but much less during those overnight hours. This insight has particular relevance for utility planners and municipal planners as well, who might be trying to figure out when and how to put EV infrastructure in place. You could think of gig drivers as, in a sense, their own fleet that could really help the capacity factor of some of these public or corridor charging areas that typically will have high utilization during common hours, but less utilization during other hours. It seems like gig drivers could help fill in some of those gaps and really potentially help the economics of a situation if they can be harnessed and planned around. And so this might be something that could help optimize these large infrastructure developments on the EV charging side for public and corridor purposes. And gig drivers should be taken into account when that planning is done. Another insight is that geography really matters when you're doing this. And so again, a note for planners, although on the whole, all of the drivers across each of the geographies were charging much more than the non-gig drivers, there was really a lot of geography dependent context that played into this. So depending on what the nature of the region was, where the airport is, how the downtown is set up, that had a pretty dramatic difference in terms of how much driving was being done across each of those sites. And so you can see it right that, you know, some places had significantly less driving for those gig drivers than other places did, even though they were all more than non-gig drivers at those respective places. And then finally, we would point out that geography matters as well when you look at the time of day. So if you look at this 24-hour load curve in terms of the average miles added per EV per day by the hour of the day, again, you see while there's overall flat utilization across the board, indicating that gig drivers are really operating at all hours of the day, there were some differences that should be taken into account. And so that context matters. And to drill in more on some of the data, I will turn the stage over to Bryn from the Rocky Mountain Institute.
Thank you. So my name is Bryn, and I am a senior associate on RMI's carbon-free transportation team. So we took an approach to the data of trimming the latitude and the longitude to be able to look specifically at the cities that we were focusing on. So we did see in a lot of the trip data that people were traveling around the country, which is really great. But what we were trying to do was determine where there needed to be more more chargers available. And so we also decided to use the Alternative Fuel Data Center's list of public EV chargers to see where there were currently existing DCFC and level 2 chargers. So what we found from trimming the data to look specifically at these cities is that while these drivers are in their cities, they are currently charging in residential areas. So roughly 90% of all charging was occurring in places like their homes, their apartments, and their condos. So this shows they have consistent access to home charging and don't really need to rely on public chargers for day-to-day gig driving requirements. But this could potentially present an issue for drivers who want to be able to switch to driving an EV, but wouldn't have consistent charging at home, such as somebody who lives in an apartment complex where there's not assigned parking and they don't have access to a charger consistently. Furthermore, another thing to think about long term is that 3 of these cities are changing parking minimums to address housing affordability. So, for example, Portland eliminated parking minimums, Phoenix has changed parking minimums, and Salt Lake City is re-examining their zoning to encourage more dense multifamily housing developments. So, this will not impact current drivers, but this could potentially have implications for future residential charging availability. And this is really important because other work has already found that drivers that live in things like smaller multifamily developments, so duplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, the very dense housing developments that these cities are trying to drive and increase development of, can face unique challenges with accessing EV charging infrastructure. So we decided to then filter out all home charging and look at, at behavior with public chargers. So we found that when drivers are charging at public chargers, they tend to stay for about 15 minutes, even less a lot of the time, and on average at about 24 kilowatt hours, which indicates that they're probably using a fast charger for a very short amount of time. So we also counted up the amount of chargers that are available in these cities. Again, this is from the Alternative Fuels Data Center. So we found that within the city, there's hundreds of level 2 chargers that are available, but at most there's only 100 DCFC chargers. And this is really important for the DCFC chargers because a number of these non-residential charging sessions are under an hour. So roughly 2/3 of all of these non-residential charging sessions are under an hour, and then a further 35% are under 15 minutes. So they're only adding a little bit of charge too. So for most, they'll go from like, let's say 30% to 20 or to 60%. So it indicates that what they're trying to do is to just top up before they can go home to complete charging. So there's some charging sessions and points of interest, which include things like libraries, grocery stores, shopping centers, or places like Costco that show potential gaps in the charging network. So here you can see a map of Salt Lake City. And the red dots are the non-home charging sessions. The green are public DCFC chargers. Again, that's from the Alternative Fuels Data Center. And then blue are points of interest. Again, things like libraries. So we decided to limit this to only looking at the public fast chargers because that fit better with the behaviors we were seeing with how people were charging. So this does reveal some potential gaps in charging locations, such as places like downtown Portland, western and northern Las Vegas, and downtown Phoenix. So these are the maps for those other cities as well. And again, looking at all of these, the red is, again, the non-home charging sessions, green is the DCFC chargers, and the blue is the points of interest. You can see potential areas where people could potentially put more chargers that would fit with this behavior around public charging. So when we're looking at where to place new chargers, it's important to look where people are stopping and for how long. So we have this whole data set where it was the periods where people were stopped but not charging. A lot of these stop durations were longer, which could again work for level 2 charging. But as we saw from the table of charging infrastructure available in these cities, there is a lot of level 2 charging available. But again, there's not very many public DCFC chargers, with Phoenix being the only one that have over 100 DCFC chargers available. And again, over a third of these charging, 2/3 of these charging sessions outside the home fit better with the DCFC chargers. So looking at their stop times in cities, what you can see is that 36% of participants' stop durations were under an hour, which would fit really well with the DCFC charging. And what we also saw is that people began their stop duration with their car at 60% or lower charge. What we saw also in the data when we were examining when did people choose to use public chargers, their car was often below 60%. So that is an indicator of a point when people begin to consider using a public charger. So what we decided to do then was to look at places where people were stopping for underneath an hour with their start state of charge being less than 60%. So this reveals some gaps, again, where people could potentially benefit from having a public charger available. This map shows the places where people are dwelling for a good period of time, as well as the DCFC and the points of interest. So dwell sessions under an hour are these little red dots, DCFC are the green, and the points of interest are the blue here. So chargers should be located where people are spending time when they're not at home. So places where they run errands, such as Costco or Target, or when they go out to eat. There are existing DCFC chargers in each of these cities, but there are network gaps. We are currently working on determining where the most optimal locations would be. We are developing some refined hex bin maps, but the initial work does show that there's some locations that could potentially benefit from having a DCFC charger installed. And then here are the maps for Portland, Las Vegas, and Phoenix. Again, the little red dots indicate dwell sessions under an hour. Green is their DCFC, and the blue is the points of interest, which includes things like libraries and grocery stores. So our key takeaways from this work indicates that while they're in their cities, the majority of these drivers are charging at home. Well, this is really good because this indicates they have consistent access to home charging, but this could potentially present a restriction for drivers who would like to be able to switch to an EV who potentially couldn't due to infrastructure limitations. We also found that there are gaps in the DCFC network that could be filled in to promote public charging, and that most rideshare drivers are using these public chargers to top up their charge, but aren't necessarily fully charging in public. So thank you for my time, and I will pass this over to Patrick.
Awesome. Thanks, Bryn. I'm here to talk about some of the results from our survey. So here at Utah State University, we helped develop and analyze a lot of the survey results from this work. You've heard some great insights about the charging and driving behaviors, and I want to tell you a little bit more now about who these gig drivers are and what they think based on their survey responses. Just a couple reminders. GPH means gas-powered or hybrid drivers, so non-fully electric. BEV is those fully electric drivers. And I want to also give a big thanks to William, one of my students, for helping do some of this analysis. All right, a couple key findings here. BEV gig drivers seem to be a little more affluent than the non-EV drivers for this work. So for instance, they tend to report driving newer vehicles, so a lot more are recent model vehicles. They also seem to have a little bit more likely to have a college degree, not live in multifamily housing, so live in single family housing, and a little bit more likely to belong to a higher income household income group, although all gig drivers were not necessarily very likely to have high incomes. This is also reflected in their responses to some survey questions about their willingness to pay for either a new vehicle purchase or a vehicle lease. So these EV drivers seem to report being more willing to pay more to buy their car or pay more per month for that. They also report being a little bit less likely to rely on gig driving for their livelihood. So for instance, a smaller portion, less than 50% of EV drivers say that this is their only source of income, whereas about 2/3 of non-EV drivers say that. They also report having a lower share of their income coming from this kind of gig work. So about 2/3 of their income on average versus 80% for non-EV drivers. This is also somewhat reflected in the amount of time they report spending on this work per week and the amount of miles they drive. We also asked the BEV drivers how often they spend their time and charge at public or home charging. I will say these results are a little bit different from the reveal data that you saw earlier. These are stated, so you might think of these as more desirable charging activities and behaviors. But still, we see this big emphasis on an importance of DC fast charging. So a large share of our EV drivers in the survey say they would or would like to charge at DC fast charging at least once a day, so about 30%. And a lot of them say they do or would want to charge at least once a week at DC fast charging. When choosing a location, they seem to prioritize the speed and reliability of the chargers. Those showed up as being the most important factors reported for location choice. The cost and affordability of chargers was also important, as was the ease of use or the location, so the convenience aspects. But still, that speed and reliability seem to be the most important pieces. We also asked drivers what they like most about using an EV for this kind of work. They reported that low maintenance costs and low operating costs were some of the biggest benefits of using EVs. As a driver. As a passenger, these drivers thought, well, passengers might like that EVs are a smooth ride and are quiet, but there's also a role for being an ambassador here. So drivers reported that a lot of their passengers liked learning about EVs from them, or for many, it was maybe the first time riding in an electric vehicle. So, gig driving could be a gateway to encourage more people to use EVs. Of course, we also asked about challenges with using EVs for gig driving work. Many of the normal EV-related challenges popped up, so range limitations, the slow speed of charging, not having enough charging stations, or not having them be reliable. And when we asked about the gig driving work factors in particular, many of our electric vehicle drivers said they would like to be paid more for having that EV, maybe a green bonus, if you will. We also asked all of our drivers and survey respondents to say what they would think about purchasing their next vehicle. Luckily, most EV drivers plan to stick with a battery electric vehicle for their next vehicle. And actually, a lot of non-EV drivers are open. So 61% said they'd be extremely or somewhat likely to choose either an electric vehicle, fully electric, or a plug-in hybrid EV for their next vehicle. There's definitely an opportunity here. We asked about some of their perceptions of EVs and compared BEV and non-BEV drivers. As you might expect, BEV drivers were more positive towards EVs or less negative, but there were still some concerns that popped up. So for instance, 2/3 of EV drivers think EVs are too expensive. And more than half had concerns about battery life and longevity. Some of the less common concerns were, not as much issues about reliability of the technology, also not many concerns about social aspects. For instance, 3/4 of non-EV drivers say they know someone who has an EV. The last thing I want to show you today from the survey is we asked about people's experiences with using these platforms. Again, maybe Uber, Lyft, or Grubhub, for instance. Not a lot of difference between EV and non-EV drivers as their opinions about this kind of work. We did notice that EV drivers are less likely to say they can make a full-time living as a gig driver. Various opinions about the ability of matching algorithms to work well, whether drivers should be considered employees. But one finding we did see is that most drivers say they're not satisfied with their pay and they don't have a lot of job security. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ian to tell you a little bit more about what we found from talking with these drivers.
Hey everyone, excited to be here and talk about my part in this study. As has been mentioned, we did a lot of outreach in order to make sure that we had some great driver response. And a lot of what we did was based on our work previous to this project, where we have done a lot of outreach to make sure to find out what drivers need and also underserved communities need. And there's a lot of overlap in order to facilitate that transition to electrified transportation. So as part of that, we developed some bilingual collateral to make sure that English speakers and Spanish speakers, who were the two languages most spoken that we had learned about rideshare drivers in these regions, to facilitate access to the study. And we also offered a generous stipend for participation in the study. And we spoke with a lot of people. So There were 2 fourth program managers working on this, traveling to 4 states several times. We had 645 people respond to surveys to see if they qualified for the study, which meant that we spoke with many more than that. We heard a lot of thoughts on the ground about what people thought about electrified transportation, some from people who drove in EVs and some people who had very minimal experience. And that was regional, as has been mentioned before. 270 people qualified to complete the initial survey. And of course, we got a lot of input throughout all 4 states, as has been mentioned. In Portland, we found that there was a very strong EV positive culture. So, we've got a smaller city built up rather than out with a robust DC fast charging infrastructure. But what stood out the most was that we had a local utility create a program offering a $25 monthly subscription service for unlimited off-peak charging. And they set those up in different business districts throughout the Portland area. Something that really stood out, though, was that as a former rideshare driver myself, I watched the installation of free DC fast charging in the TNC staging lot at the PDX airport. And there was some mixed reactions at first. They chose a location that was adjacent to the smoking section. So there were a lot of angry smokers who presented the fact that they had to walk a little bit further to get into a covered structure. But other than that, which faded after a few weeks, I saw a tremendous uptick in the amount of rideshare drivers using an EV at PDX. So I think that's an important consideration for airports across the United States. Salt Lake City, we had kind of the opposite impression. You can see the TNC hold lot in the background. There was no lighting, minimal facilities, a couple of porta potties, and the nearest DCFC was a few miles away from the airport. So we found that to be a missed opportunity to help rideshare drivers get into EVs, or at least incentivize it a little bit more. And drivers complained a lot about the basic amenities at the airport, saying that basically the EVs were the furthest thing from their mind when they couldn't find a running bathroom and nobody knew where the nearest charger was. And I imagine these things will change with more and more people adopting EVs, but ideally it would go the other direction to facilitate that transition. Las Vegas had a much larger landmass, and so drivers expressed a lot more range anxiety. They didn't know where the chargers were. And what we found was that in the highest traffic areas, like along the Strip and at the airport, there was very limited DCFC access. You basically had to drive out to the suburbs to access a fast charger. And that said, drivers spend an hour or more at the airport or TNC staging areas, and often running their engines. So I think that would be a great place to focus in the future for charger installation. Level 2 would work. But I do want to say that from most of the conversations and from my own experience as a rideshare driver, driving between 100 and 200 miles a day, charging at home for most people isn't quite going to be enough. DCFC infrastructure needs to be widespread and along those corridors, traveled a lot, and at those places that rideshare drivers are waiting for rides. So level 2 and DCFC charging really needs to be focused on, as well as affordability, like we saw in Portland. Phoenix also is a sprawling landmass, and also the 6th largest city in the U.S. by population. So if you consider the fact that if you're to drive to one of the newer suburbs, which is one of the more desirable suburbs, it's just how Phoenix works. Every new suburb further out from the center becomes the most desirable place, and so everyone wants to move there. And if you're picking someone up from the airport and driving them to that suburb of Queen Creek that I'm using as an example, it's 33 and a half miles. And at the time of the study, there wasn't a DCFC charger. There wasn't a charger in Queen Creek, and the nearest one was 9 miles away in Gilbert. So, obviously a lot of input that I got from drivers was that they didn't see it as a realistic possibility for them because of lack of charging infrastructure that they perceived, But also because things are so spread out, there was less exposure, I think, per capita to EVs. So I think that what we noticed firsthand in Phoenix was that a lot of the people who tended to drive EVs were wealthier people, and they were doing it more as a side gig. Often they were retirees, just finding a way to stay busy and social. So they could afford to charge at home, and whenever they felt like they were done working, they could go home. And of course, they weren't trying to make a complete living doing it. And I want to say that during this study, Uber and then Lyft rolled out EV rental programs for their drivers. And so that started to change the dynamic a bit. And I think that, that it's something to consider as something that possibly could have mildly skewed the results of this study. Because as we saw, the majority of people who were doing rideshare and EVs were wealthier people. I think that over time, what's happened is that as those rental programs have grown, a lot more people are driving EVs who've realized that that's a viable possibility. Now, I do want to say that in Phoenix, a lot of those renters did say that they found renting to be complicated and expensive. And so when those programs were first rolling out, what we saw was a lot of drivers who tried out an EV, but because there wasn't enough education around EVs when they rented the cars, they quickly gave up after a week and went back to driving a gas-powered vehicle. So we were all over the place in all seasons, day and night, trying to make sure that we gathered enough information to make this a valid study. And we pooled our resources together in the subgroup and came up with our basic takeaways. So the first one is that charging infrastructure and accessibility and quality need to be focused on. So locations need to be prioritized, as well as the reliability of chargers. Economic incentives and cost management are important considerations. If rideshare drivers can't afford to get into an EV, they're not going to. If they can't afford to charge an EV, they're going to give up pretty quickly. And so incentive programs run by the federal government, as well as local governments, and especially utilities, can go a very long way. Uber and Lyft have been offering incentives to help their drivers get into EVs, sometimes very generous incentives. And now the DNC companies are getting into that as well. DoorDash is releasing a pilot program to monetarily incentivize getting into an EV. And I know that Amazon Flex is working on something similar. Regional adaptation and integration are important. So again, local context matters. We need to think about what the realities are in the ground, because there's no one size fits all solution. We can put chargers at the PDX airport. If we put chargers at the Phoenix airport, it'll help, but it won't go as far when drivers are going, 30 miles or more for their fares. One great thing that we did notice about the Phoenix airport was that they take care of their drivers. They had multiple TNC staging lots. They had indoor facilities with running water and bathrooms and food available, which was quite different than what we saw in a couple other cities. We need to address specific challenges for gig drivers, considering their usage, which is different than the general population. We need to think about where they need to charge the most, because, for example, if that driver is going to Queen Creek, they need to be able to charge when they get to Queen Creek. We need to provide educational and support programs. It was on an earlier slide, but something that I found in Phoenix was talking to a driver that I suppose we can call it a political divide in background information about EVs. One driver said, an EV, do I look like I shop at Whole Foods? And so there was kind of this perception that EVs are not for all people. And so we need to make sure that people realize that they are viable for most. And we need to think beyond infrastructure. So comprehensive service needs, and really we just need to come together and figure out the best way, the multifaceted way to facilitate the transition to EVs for gig drivers. So prioritizing charging infrastructure near where drivers live and work, making it easier for drivers to charge at home so that they can start out their day with a full charge, targeted economic incentives and education support, and again, of course, seeing the human behind that car and making sure that they have everything they need to be successful. So based on the information that we learned talking to drivers and our other work that preceded this, we recently put together a white paper on best practices to facilitate the transition to EVs for gig drivers. You can find it by scanning that code. I had to plug that, so please forgive me. Our director would scowl at me if I didn't. And that wraps up my portion of it. So thank you. I'll pass it back to James.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Ian. There we go. Yeah, thanks, Ian. So, yeah, this report is great, and thank you to everybody who worked on this. This is great work, and really, as I thought was really interesting, that this is probably the largest TNC study that has been completed. So, really, really appreciate the hard work and insight that everybody's done. So that report, please go to the Fourth website and find it. We will also be compiling these findings, this white paper, with all of the other white papers associated with those 12 sub-projects that I described earlier, along with, in those 5 focus areas. And we'll be posting those to our website, liveelectric.org. So please, like, for example, as I mentioned, we have the e-mobility hub. We have the e-car share for low-income housing. So we have different reports looking at different impacts, and this will be one of those great ones that we'll be able to add on there. So that's it. And I think we're ready for questions. I'll hand it back to Sibia.
Thank you, James. If all of our speakers can please turn on your webcam. I'm also going to add the slide that has our information, contact info for all of the speakers today. So as we go through Q&A, if you would like to reach out to any of the speakers, emails can be found here. We did get one question, and I believe this is for Patrick, which says, data shows that public gig driver charging happens overnight, but you're focusing on dwell times around businesses, which likely are not open during the time of charging. How does that impact your determination of gaps in the charging networks?
Sure, I could take a quick stab at this question. Yeah, it's a really good point. We want to make sure that the timing for accessibility is lining up. I will say when we did our surveys, we found that drivers reported what they were doing while they were charging, and one of the big things that came up is food. So if we think about maybe locating those overnight charging locations near maybe, let's say, late night or 24-hour dining establishments, that could be some benefits for them. I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to add anything to that.
Thank you, Patrick. A question just came in. A couple of the presenters mentioned that BEV drivers were less likely to drive full-time or make a higher percentage on their income for gig driving. Why do you think this is? That was the first part. I'll read the second part so I don't jumble you all up. And if anyone wants to take that question, you can just go for it.
I can take part of that. As I mentioned, a lot of these drivers are doing it part-time as a side hustle or because they're retired. So they're not leaning on it completely to make their living, often in cases like that. Otherwise, we've seen drivers who came from taxi driving, and the traditional taxi driving schedule is 12 hours on and 12 hours off. And so it's kind of across the board there.
I think it also might have to do with the sort of barrier to entry for getting an EV. The higher purchase price might mean that the people who are doing that are more likely to have maybe some more financial resources available to them to make that leap into the somewhat unknown.
Thank you. I'm going to do a moderator privilege question and ask something. I see there's another question from the attendee, but just wanted to see and just get everyone's perspective on the panel. what part of what findings did you all find most surprising, whether it's from the data gathered in the survey, whether that is from the outreach to the gig drivers or app download? What were some things that where was unexpected, or maybe you didn't expect that to happen? And I can have Yossi, you go first, Bryn, and then Patrick, Ian, and James.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would say that, one of the big things that often comes up when you talk about public infrastructure for charging is how to balance the need to recoup those investments through demand charges and things like that from a utility standpoint. And I think we were particularly surprised at FlexCharging that there was a utilization and potentially an optimization opportunity here when you looked at gig drivers to help spread out when those chargers were used, especially during hours when they were less used. And if there was a way to engage in a broader partnership with gig companies and who could encourage their drivers to go to certain places, this might be part of an overarching solution to help make the economic justification of those public charging resources that much more viable, which would be good for everyone at the end of the day.
Bryn?
From RMI's perspective, we were very surprised by the amount of home charging that was occurring while people were in their cities. And then when people were using public chargers, just how short of a time they were staying and the ways that they were treating it. It was really interesting to see that people were often just treating it as a way to top up rather than completely filling up their car, for example. So I think that really indicated that people really do have reliable home charging, which again is good, but that does present an issue for people who might not have that, which was something interesting to see in the data.
I'd add that drivers' perceptions of what was the most important about charging was a little bit different than I thought. Not just the cost. The cost is important, obviously, but it's the speed, reliability. So it's really about the opportunity cost of time. Time is really valuable to them, especially when they're seeking work. So charging that is readily available in the right place, fast, available, not broken, is really important to them.
Mirroring that, noticing that drivers expressed that the thought of charging even for 20 minutes or 30 minutes just seemed unfathomable to them, to take a break that long when they could be driving and making money. And there's that aspect of TNC work where it can be kind of addicting. It's almost like gambling, because you get those immediate shots of dopamine whenever you get a ping on your phone that there's a possible way to make money in the moment. And so that, and the fact that once you charge up to 80%, it dramatically slows down how much you're able to charge anyway. I think that the people just want to charge a little bit at a time whenever they have to. The biggest surprise for me was the vast difference in perspectives depending on what city I was in. So again, in Portland, people were pretty excited about EVs. Salt Lake City as well. Las Vegas, it just seemed like people could care less about anything other than what was happening in the moment. And then in Phoenix, there were such strong opinions against EVs that I encountered sometimes. It was really tough to get people to even take this survey in Phoenix.
I'd say for one of the things that was surprising that kind of adds on what a lot of the speakers have talked about, which I think we need to do is have education on how to charge properly. And that need, I was surprised looking at the data at how frequently the top off was happening. And as Ian just pointed out, time is of the essence. So they just want to do it for little periods of time. Although for fast charging, the more empty your battery is, the faster you charge. So it actually is counterintuitive that it's a faster process by running your battery down and then getting a charge than it is by doing this constant top off. So I think that there's a need for education, and also that people have to change the way, and this is, I think, in general for all EVs, but change the way you refuel your vehicle, the way you perceive it, versus this, you drive in your car, oh, I'm at half empty, or I'm at this point, now I need to go refuel, and approach it slightly differently, especially where time is of the essence. You can get a faster charge at that lower, when you're, drain your battery. So that's going to have to require, though, the TNC operator, the driver, to understand where their next job is, how much range they have, where the charging infrastructure is. And that's a complex calculation that will be challenged for anybody. So if we could automate that process for the drivers, I think then we can help accelerate the EV adoption for gig drivers.
I hope you're
Thank
listening and left.
Thank you, everyone. I believe we got to Kathleen's question, but real quickly before we wrap up shortly, Bryn, there was a question for you on, was the short charging time consistent across the different locations, or was the difference between cities?
We didn't really see anything incredibly significant. It did seem like people preferred to mostly charge for shorter durations across cities if they were using a public charger. Again, people were by and large treating it as a way to seemingly just top off before they went home to complete their charge.
Thank you. And one final question to wrap it up, since we're talking about key takeaways here, and we want our attendees to understand the key takeaways from this. So, from each and every one of you, can you just let us know what is a one sentence takeaway from the study? Again, we've talked about key findings, we've talked about what was surprising. What's one key takeaway you want our attendees to take away from the study, from the program, and from our engagement with TNC drivers? And James, we can have you go first.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I think that I kind of mentioned that in what surprised me, the key takeaway. But I will say this: I think one thing that's important is to have more strategic programs with, as someone who's with the utility, but also then partnering with these broader organizations, Lyft and Uber and the other gig companies, to create programs that can make it easier for these drivers. I think that's that. I think that was one of my takeaways from this.
Patrick?
EV gig drivers can be ambassadors for electric vehicles, introducing them to people who may be hesitant or haven't heard enough, and getting them to see inside and what it's like to use them.
Thank you. Jossi?
Building off of what James said, partnership is key here. And the way to address those sort of multifaceted barriers at its heart, I think, is a lot of data and not just assumptions.
Thank you. Bryn?
Access to home charging seems to be really valuable. So for people who are coming into this, especially in these cities that are trying to address their housing crises with increasing denser development and potentially limiting parking, it is going to be really important to think about how do we offer consistent charging to people who might not have it at home.
Thank you. And finally, Ian?
Mirroring what Patrick said, rideshare drivers are ambassadors for EVs, and so I think that we need to prioritize their needs, but also considering the fact that they are often gasoline super users. Even if they're driving a hybrid, they're having a much bigger impact than the average person. So it's important to consider how we can facilitate that transition. It's been great working with all of you and seeing how each person has shown in this project. And I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us on this webinar and for all of the hard work you've done on the WestSmart study. As I mentioned, we will be sharing a webinar recap with everyone. That will include the webinar recording as well as additional resources and the slide decks from all of our presenters today. If you have any additional questions, I believe we went through all of the questions we had, but this could get some some juices flowing for more questions you might have for our panelists here. So their emails will be included in the email as well. And with that, I want to say thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope you all have a good rest of your week. And thank you again to all of our presenters today. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks. Looking forward